Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. Despite several attempts to end the ban in the 1960s, Hugh B. made one final attempt in 1969 and almost succeeded. However, the attempt was nixed by Harold B. Lee. Dr. Matt Harris will give us more information on this, and I think you're going to hear some really amazing stuff in this next episode. We'll also talk briefly about some of the BYU protests where other teams were protesting the church's stance with blacks in the priesthood ban and temple ban. Check out our conversation. I also want to remind everybody we've got our latest transcripts with Simon Southerton and George Potter, and all of our books on black history, our transcripts are on sale this week. So please check that out. Go to gospeltangents.com/shop and you can pick up a copy for just $6 this week. Also, if you'd like a copy of this transcript and all future transcripts for just $10 a month, I will send those to you as soon as these interviews are completed. And this is going to be an amazing interview. Now back to our conversation.
By 1968, I'm sure you know about this, that dozens of athletic teams will start to protest BYU. And they're very clear about this. We're really protesting BYU athletics, but it's the church racial policies that we're after. So they're using BYU to get to the church. And in the midst of all of this, Hugh B. will try yet another time to get this ban reversed. And in September of 1969, in the midst of some very, very heavy protesting and very unflattering news coverage, President Brown will visit with two of David O. McKay's sons and tell him, help them and say, can you help me? We've got to do something about this. Because if we don't get this ban lifted before your father dies, and keep in mind that President McKay is in his 90s at this point, and he's got moments of lucidity and he's got moments where he's not lucid. Good days and bad days. But if we don't get this ban lifted while he's alive, then your father's successor and his successor's successor won't lift it. Meaning Joseph Fielding Smith and Harold B. Lee, both of whom were doctrinal hardliners. So in September of 1969, during the midst of some heavy protesting at BYU, the two McKay sons and President McKay, they go to the Hotel Utah where President McKay now lives and he's convalescing. And there's a lot of details I'm leaving out, but anyway, there's a book that had been published by, an article had been published at this point by a Mormon graduate student at Cornell named Stephen Taggart. And Taggart's book, we think that it's superficial today, and it is. It's not very deeply researched, but he argues that the policy was born out of Joseph Smith's era, just essentially out of 19th century conditions of slavery. There was nothing divine about it. That's what he argues. And so anyway, the McKay sons will use, in Brown, when Taggart, his thesis comes out, they'll use Taggart's research and say, look, this is just a policy. This is the policy, it's not a doctrine. So if it's just a policy of President McKay, then we can overturn this. And so, anyway, President McKay agrees to ordain a black man named Monroe Fleming, a loyal member at the Hotel Utah. This is in September of 1969.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
So he agrees to ordain Monroe Fleming to the priesthood. And it's interesting that the document that I have that talks about this, it just says Monroe Fleming. It doesn't say all persons of African ancestry. But you can only imagine that if you allow Monroe Fleming the priesthood based on his worthiness, of course, then that means that other worthy black members of the church can now hold the priesthood. That's how I interpret that. So anyway, so President McKay, who had been badgered by Brown for years to do this, and not just Brown but others as well, but had been badgered, and he resisted it for a lot of reasons, particularly thinking that it might harm the church in the South, and also Joseph Fielding Smith and Harold B. Lee, who had very strong feelings about the ban. And he didn't want to create a hardship with members of the quorum. So he agrees to do it, and when Harold B. Lee and Joseph Fielding Smith, mostly Harold B. Lee, because Joseph Fielding Smith is now in his 90s and his health is getting the best of him. But when Harold B. Lee finds out about it, puts an end to it and just says, this is not something we can do. And if we do it, it has to have buy-in from the Quorum of the 12, the full quorum. And so President McKay, I'm going to paraphrase, but he says, I'm too old to fight him. I'm not going to do it. We'll let President Lee worry about this problem. That's what he says, this problem. And keep in mind that Harold Lee is now in his early 70s, and he is not the next in line for the presidency, but he's after Joseph Fielding Smith. And it was long believed that President Smith wouldn't be the church president for very long based on his age. So they thought that in Harold Lee they would have another David O. who would lead the church for 20 plus years. Obviously it didn't happen that way. He's only church president for 18 months before this untimely illness takes him. But anyway, so everyone thought in leadership that Harold B. Lee would be a church president for many years. And so let Elder Lee worry about this problem, President McKay thinks. And so what happens is Brown, as you can imagine, is distraught because this is the time to lift the ban. But I need President McKay to do this, but he doesn't want to fight Elder Lee. So anyway, President Brown goes back to President McKay and he said, if I can get each of the members of the 12 to support this, remember this is a policy according to Brown, not a doctrine. And it doesn't require some divine revelation, according to Brown. He said, President McKay, if I can get the majority of the 12 to buy in, would you support this? And McKay said, I'll support it if you can get the majority of the 12 to buy in. And so strategically, when Alvin Dyer, who's now in the first presidency, and when Harold B. Lee are out of town on church business, President Brown will meet with the majority of members of the 12 to get their support. And they agree to overturn the ban. This is in November of 1969. At the same time that the Western Athletic Conference, they're scheduled to hold a vote to kick BYU out of the conference. This is the stuff going on behind the scenes.
There is a lot going on because we haven't even hit Benson yet.
What's instructive here is so many Latter-day Saint scholars have told the BYU athletic protest, but they're missing the other component, which is the stuff going on behind the scenes in church leadership. I don't think you can untie the two. They're really inextricably linked. And that's another thing that President Brown wants to lift the ban to get the athletic protest off their back. And he even tells, in November of '69, he tells Kenneth Feitzer, the Stanford president, he calls him up. He said, this is Hugh Brown of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I just want you to know we're going to lift the ban.
He calls the Stanford University
calls
president.
the Stanford president, tells him we're going to lift the ban. He even writes him a letter.
And the reason why was because Stanford had just canceled some sort of a series. Was it football, basketball? Do you remember?
Basketball. It was basketball. It was that fall they canceled their contract with BYU basketball. I think those are the days when Stanford and BYU were both in the WAC.
I think Stanford was in the Pac-8.
Or Pac.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, BYU's in the WAC.
Yeah,
Stanford was
you're
in
right.
the
You're
Pac-8.
right. They had a contract to play each other out of conference. I think it's what it was.
Right.
Anyway, so he tells Feitzer this, and so President Brown, who's been one to talk to the public before, and he also gives an interview with a couple of news outlets too, that we're going to lift the ban. This is November of '69. Anyway, so he gets the apostles to buy into it, and when Elder Lee comes back from his church assignment, he realizes what Brown has done. He's furious, as you can imagine. He feels like it's a slight to his authority. It's done behind closed doors without his input. How could you do this? And Elder Lee goes to each of the apostles who agreed to support President Brown, and he convinces them to change their support, and they do. And Spencer W. Kimball, who's going to be the president of the Quorum of the 12 one day under Harold B. Lee's leadership, goes to President Brown and he says, he's sobbing, he's weeping, and he said, I know you're right, we need to lift the ban, but I fear Brother Lee. And by that he meant that he was going to have to work under Brother Lee, and he didn't want to create any sort of antagonism between these two men and their positions in leadership. So he sobs to President Brown and says that I have to change my vote to support him. And so with all of that turmoil in the fall of 1969, and with President Brown and the majority of the Quorum of the 12 agreeing to lift the ban in 1969, Elder Lee wants to put a stop to that, and he recommends they produce a second First Presidency statement in December of 1969, the first being 20 years earlier in 1949 with Lowry Nelson and George Albert Smith. Well, this second First Presidency statement reaffirms the ban, and they want the First Presidency to sign off on it. This is interesting. They want the guy who's trying to overturn the ban to sign his name to it, Hugh B. Brown.
Mm-hmm.
And Brown reads a draft, and he says, I can't sign this. And he's weeping as he reads it. And Harold Lee, who's a very dominant man and a very incredibly skilled and able church administrator, but not known for his compassionate side, at least among the inner, anyway. A very volatile personality, for his biographer concedes, which is his son-in-law. Volatile personality. Anyway, so Harold Lee wants to form this committee to put the statement together, and he puts on the committee a guy named G. Homer Durham, who was the president of Arizona State University. He's a political scientist, and he would later be called in as a general authority and be the managing director over the church historical department. This is in the late 70s. But in 1969, he was an academic serving as the president of ASU in Tempe. And so they asked him to do it, and I guess the reason why they asked him is Gordon Hinckley is also on the committee, and he and Hinckley were missionary companions, as I recall. I think probably Elder Hinckley at the time wanted to have his good friend and his academic friend, sit on the committee. Also, a young Neil Maxwell was on the committee. And so they asked G. Homer Durham, Gordon Hinckley, and Neil Maxwell to each produce drafts. And I think the Harold Lee presented a draft too, I think. Maybe he didn't, I don't recall. But anyway, there are 3 different drafts, and Elder Gordon B. Hinckley, his task is to meld the 3 drafts together. That was his assignment that Lee had given him. And he said it was one of the most difficult assignments I've ever had in church leadership, creating this very difficult draft to produce a statement that we still were going to support this ban. When the final draft is, when they amalgamate all the different drafts, it's done. They want Brown to sign it. He reads it and weeps. There's no statement of civil rights. And he's just crestfallen. And he tells Lee, he said, I'll sign this under one condition, if you put civil rights back in there. We already talked about it in 1963 at conference. And so Elder Lee agrees to put the civil rights statement in there. And the story goes from the Brown family, so this is his own family who recount the story, that Hugh B. Brown signs the document weeping as he does so, because he doesn't support it. And the other signature was N. Eldon Tanner. President McKay was too sick. This is December of 1969, and President McKay will die in January of 70. So he's on his last legs. So the 2 First Presidency counselors will sign the document, and that's the context behind that second document in 1969. Is all the stuff going on with BYU and behind the scenes with President Brown and President McKay.
And if I recall, didn't it say something about we don't know why the ban exists, is only God knows, or something like that?
Yeah, so just say a quick thought on that. That's the first time in any document that I've seen where the church now moves to a we don't know position, which becomes sort of a quasi-official line for the next 2 or 3 decades after 1970, which is really interesting because before that, when you're Joseph Fielding Smith writing the books that you write in Mormon doctrine, to say we don't know when you read those books, they know. So really that line it's a throwaway line in my view. It's based on a response to the civil rights movement. When people ask, why can't your church give black people priesthood rights? Well, we don't know. And that's the response. And in 1968, during the midst of a lot of this protesting at BYU, the First Presidency, there's a meeting they have. President McKay's there, and there's Hugh B. Brown's there, N. Eldon Tanner, Alvin Dyer, and Joseph Fielding Smith. You recall there were several counselors with President McKay in his later years. Mm-hmm. Anyway, so they were all there, and I think it was President McKay who said, he told the counselors, he said, when people ask us about the priesthood ban, we shouldn't talk about the curse of Cain or anything like that. We should just keep our we should say that to people we don't know, and keep our utterances very simple and positive towards black people, Negro people, as he says. So President McKay, in a moment of lucidity, is recognizing the challenges of trying to defend a priesthood ban, telling black people they're cursed in the midst of the civil rights movement. It's just not a good selling point.
No.
So he recognizes that the public relations dictate that just keep expressions simple and praiseworthy. And that's the context in which they create the we don't know statement, because they're trying to remove some of these justifications that got them into hot water. And they still believe it, of course, but yet that's now the new line is let's just say we don't know. And it really, for me as a scholar reading this stuff, it just really speaks to the challenges of having to deal with a very interesting issue. And also it speaks to the idea that, the brethren interpret the scriptures differently. I mean, Hugh B. Brown clearly did not read the Old Testament the same way that Bruce R. McConkie or Joseph Fielding Smith read it. And even President McKay, I've looked at his writings, and I don't think that I've ever seen anything in his writings, and I read a lot of his private writings too, where he ever said that black people were cursed.
McKay never said black people were cursed.
Yeah, not that I can think of. And he does refer to the Book of Abraham and the less valiant position. That's a scriptural proof text that Latter-day Saints would typically use to talk about the premortal existence. So he does talk about that. But I can't recall an instance where he says, black people bore the mark of a divine curse. I don't think he believed it.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Now, when we look at it from 49 to 69, do you view that as progress from, in 1949, it's a doctrine of God, and then in 1969, well, we don't know. I mean, would you view that as progress?
Well, I don't know about progress. That's a heavy word. Progress is Spencer W. Kimball in the Revelation of 1978. That's progress. I would see this as something that's clearly evolving, right? Their racial views are evolving. And what's interesting is you may have heard of James R. Clark. He's a relative. He's a BYU religion professor. And he's a distant relative, I think, of J. Reuben Clark. And you've probably seen, what's the title of it? Messages of the First Presidency. It's a 5-volume book that starts in 1965, and I think the last edition's published in 75.
Okay.
Anyway, I'm sure you've run into it over the years. It was popular back in the day. Anyway, it's basically 5 volumes of LDS First Presidency messages. And he had to get special permission from the brethren in Salt Lake to publish these books. I think Bookcraft did it, as I recall.
Okay.
Anyway, so as he was getting permission, everybody pointed him to the church historian, which was Joseph Fielding Smith at the time. And he went into President Smith's office in Salt Lake City, told him what he was doing. BYU, he knew he was, BYU religion professor. And it was really interesting. President Smith said, I give you my blessing. I'll let you publish those things. But there's a couple that you shouldn't put in there. The 1949 First Presidency Statement was one of them.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So, and I think he mentioned something, that there was one on polygamy. There was some statement I think he wanted to include on plural marriage that he wanted him to shy away from. But what was interesting is that tells me that the brethren were very conscious of what was going on in the 1960s. And they had used that 49 First Presidency Statement in mission sermons, and you can see different general authorities visiting missions and giving this statement. And the BYU religion professors were handing the 49 Statement out to their students, so it clearly was the prevailing thought of the day. But by the later part of the 60s, when the civil rights movement kicks into high gear, I can't find any evidence that people are using this 49 Statement. And by 65, when Clark goes to Joseph Fielding Smith and asks for permission, this is 1960, I think it was 64. No, it's 65. Anyway, and he says, don't use that statement. So President Smith is, I think he's thinking about the optics of it all. And by 69, with all the context we just talked about, the BYU and the President Brown stuff behind the scenes, that becomes the new we don't know line to kind of, keep us off the hot seat. Because one of the things that you learn when you go through the 60s and you look at the brethren and their writings, and you look at the church news, public relations events, when they open up a new temple, for example, the Washington, D.C. temple, the press is there, they get so tired of being asked about the Negro policy. Everywhere they go, from the 60s, in my humble opinion, from the 1960s on, it seems like everywhere they're at in public where the media is there, that first thing they want to know is not about that beautiful temple we just created. They want to know about the Negro ban and when are you going to lift it. And if you read their writings, I mean, you can imagine this is burdensome. They have a vision to share the gospel, to run the church, to, fulfill the mission of the church. And these pesky journalists just want to know about the ban. And it's hard to tell them about the ban, especially if you have these Protestant notions that black people are cursed. This is something they don't understand or they don't accept. And or much less that they're less valiant in a pre-mortal life. I mean, very Mormon language here. How do you explain that to somebody? Well, you don't want to explain it to somebody. And so they get so tired of answering it. And finally, at one point, when Harold B. Lee was sworn in as the new church president, he was asked at his inauguration, first thing, when are you going to lift the ban? And President Lee was ready for it. These things are not, surprising to them.
Mm-hmm.
So when are you going to lift the ban? And he says, well, I'm going to paraphrase, but he says, I don't even know why people like you ask me this question, because you're not a member of my faith, and what difference does it make to you? I'm being really crass about it, but that's really what he's saying is, what difference does it make? It doesn't affect you. And but anyway, Spencer Kimball, when he's the new church president, he's faced with the same thing. And it really just bothers them.
Mm-hmm. I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Dr. Matt Harris. In our next conversation, we'll talk about President Kimball's tenure as church president. Matt makes some really bold claims.
When he's the church president, the first thing he wants to do is to lift the ban. He has all of these experiences that he's gathered. He has, keep in mind, in the fall of '69, he's already agreed to lift the ban, right?
Right.
He's already gone on record to his son. In a letter that he writes his son Edward in 1963, he said, I think this ban might be a possible error.
Thank you so much for listening. Make sure that you like our page on facebook.com/gospeltangents. You can subscribe at youtube.com/gospeltangents. We're also on Twitter @gospeltangents, as well as make sure that you subscribe on iTunes so you don't miss any of our episodes. Thanks again for listening. Click here to subscribe, here for a transcript, and over here you'll see some more of our videos. Thanks again.